Hello, everyone. ReNew Foundation, the philanthropic arm of ReNew Power, is delighted to host today's session. Today, we have with us an absolutely exemplary set of panelists from around the world who have really committed themselves to finding solutions to the climate emergency the world is facing. In attendance, we also have an eminent set of global audiences who've joined us from the government, policymakers, business leaders, and financiers. We also have some representation from the next generation from some business schools and engineering schools here in India. So we're delighted about that as well. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion on green recovery, key to a resilient post-pandemic planet. I would now like to introduce the panelists who actually need absolutely no introduction. But as a formality, we have Dr. Pradeep Surya, Global Executive Coordinator and Director, Global Environment Finance at UNDP. We look forward to your views on inclusive green financing and how sustainable recovery strategies can be more gender sensitive. I'm really excited about that part of your commentary, Pradeep. Justin Wallen, again, needs no introduction and is an extremely accomplished journalist. Some of his recent articles have got me to think about climate in new ways. And I'm really grateful for that, Justin. Justin is an energy and environment correspondent for Time magazine. And I look forward to your views also on the impact of the lack of leadership on climate in the US and what that means for the world. Dr. Ajay Mathur is the Director General of TERI, again, very well known and as a leader of this premier climate think tank in India. He will share his thoughts around steps which various stakeholders should take to build a green, clean and sustainable India with reference to the cities in a post-COVID India. Greg Gershner is an executive director at Aspen Institute and runs the energy and environment program there. It's one of the longest running programs at Aspen, I'm told. We hope to hear from you on how industry, academia, state collaborations can lead to the emergence of cutting edge technologies. We've seen the states in the US take lead in climate change, and something I think we can learn from here in India, where it's been the other way around. We've had more leadership at the center, and we can do with a lot more at the state. Soma, very delighted to have you, Soma, as a Soul Woman panelist here. You contribute so much to the energy, infra, and policy space in India. And I look forward to hearing about policies which will be required to help energy and infrastructure sector in India to evolve in the days ahead. And finally, Sumant, who's the founder and chairman of ReNew, which is India's leading renewable energy company, bringing about the biggest energy transition, we believe, in this country for over 1 billion people and changing their lives irrevocably. Moderating today's session can be, we couldn't have thought of anybody better than Akshat, who's going to really weave in to this discussion, the context of what India is doing and the role India is playing in the global energy transition context in an after COVID world. Over to you, Akshat. Thank you for doing this. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Vaishali. It wasn't that long ago that we had a financial crisis, maybe a decade, and that crisis was handled very differently from the crisis that we are handling today. They are different crises, of course, but one thing is clear this time, that to get economic growth going again, we're going to have to put in money into the economy, and that money also has to be aligned with our goals to cut emissions. That change in tone is partly because of the Paris Climate Agreement, which pretty much every country in the world has signed, and even the US right now is still in it before the November deadline comes through. And so what happens in the next few months is going to be very important in determining the emissions trajectory that the world puts itself on for the next few decades. I thought perhaps one place where we could start, given it is the Democratic National Convention in the US, is with Justin. And maybe you could tell us where current politics on green recovery stands in the US with the upcoming elections and how that might shape up.
Yeah, well, thank you, Akshat, and thank you to ReNew Foundation. Glad to be here. Um, I think it's an interesting picture right now. Of course, right now we're in a stemming the hurt phase of dealing with the pandemic here in the US. There's still a health crisis. We have not gotten back to normal. And so much of the funds that have been spent thus far have been spent on the health emergency, sort of immediate relief, and not so much even considered green recovery. That said, you know, the amount of money that has been used for you know, the energy sector or energy related industry has been largely supportive of fossil fuels, 72 billion, according to Energy Policy Tracker, which is this collaboration of various NGOs. So looking forward, though, of course, when you're thinking about recovery and green stimulus spending, the picture is not bright. It certainly isn't bright under this administration, so long as Trump is president and Republicans control one house of Congress. It's pretty unlikely that there's going to be any sort of green stimulus funding. The question, of course, as many things here in the US, the question is, you know, what happens with the presidential election? And so you get really two divergent paths. You know, under a Joe Biden presidency, there is a great interest and focus on a potential green stimulus. Joe Biden oversaw green stimulus funding, or rather the stimulus funding in 2009. That was the largest clean energy investment in the United States, $90 billion that he oversaw to various clean energy initiatives. And, you know, he plans to do a much bigger sort of investment program, green investment program, if he were to be elected. And then, of course, under President Trump, well, there just wouldn't be a focus on that. That said, I think, you know, and maybe we'll get into this later in the discussion, but I think the texture of a climate in the United States under President Trump's second term would be more complicated than just, you know, the US is doing nothing. There's, of course, the subnational picture, and there's also the increasing pressure from other countries that are acting. So I'll leave it there, but would love to discuss more later.
No, that's fair. And I think I live here in London, and perhaps the region that is doing the most right now on a green recovery is Europe, with its Green Deal that is set to pass through Parliament because there's lots of support, and the amount of money that the government has committed. Perhaps this is a good moment to bring in Dr. Mathur. You know, here in the US, we are seeing that, you know, politics is going to determine whether the recovery is green or not. In Europe, that's certainly the case. Politics has aligned with the green recovery. How are you reading things in India today?
Akshat, first of all, many thanks to Sumant and Vaishali for putting this together. I think it's extremely timely, amazingly delighted that you have this extremely broad spectrum of people here. To come to your question, Akshat, I think there are two underlying trends that we need to start with. The first is that there has been a very strong commitment to renewable energy in India for now a long period of time. This has come to the point where electricity from solar energy is the cheapest electricity available in India, but only when the sun is shining. And under Sumant's leadership, ReNew has just put in a bid which has won a contract for round-the-clock electricity. That's 24 hours electricity from solar plus batteries at a price which will be competitive with that of coal when it is delivered, I think in 2 years' time or some time frame like that. In other words, there is a strong commitment. The second point that I wanted to make is that in terms of the stimulus, the amount of fiscal space that the government has for investing in this stimulus is relatively small. The Indian budget is not all that large, and almost 80% of it is tied into various kinds of payments, either as salaries or as loan repayments, and so on. So the edge is very small. Consequently, the only amount of actual cash transfers that we are seeing, which is approximately 10% of the budget, about $30 billion, has gone into providing cash transfers to the most needy people, food to the most needy people, and so on. The vast amount of the stimulus has been focused on making credit available, so risk guarantee schemes and so on, which provide credit, and particularly in two sectors. One is agriculture, and the other is small and medium enterprises. Now, apart from this, there's also a package that provides, towards extension of credit to industry through moratoria, etc. So, ensuring that things keep alive. So, intrinsically, there isn't a great amount of greenness in the stimulus package as it was announced. Yeah. Yet, what it makes available is credit, particularly for the SME and the agriculture sectors. Right. So the key there is if there is green equity, then you can pull in the credit into the agriculture and the SME sectors. Right. So for example, if you want to do solar pumps, that makes great sense. If you can bring the equity, you can get the credit. If you want to do energy efficiency in industry, you can pull in credit. So really it is about configuring the finance so that we can make the package green. Right.
But this would be a good place.
But let me end there.
Yeah, it'd be a good place to bring in Soma. I mean, one thing that is also happening alongside the points that Dr. Mathur outlined is that India is, putting out an auction for coal right now. I mean, what's the thinking there, and will investors be coming? I mean, that's clearly a push towards jobs and revenue raising, but will that be fruitful? You're muted.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me this platform. So it's a good question on coal. As we know, India has the 4th largest reserve of coal. And so while we're still dabbling and we're moving ahead aggressively on renewable power, we cannot kiss away the coal reserves as far as India is concerned. However, the thinking is, point one, that India still imports coal. And the understanding is that these auctions are going to help industry to stop those imports and to replace that with domestic coal. Having said that, I think there's one thing which we have to keep in mind. I do not see a huge interest, at least from the private sector, including private thermal-based power companies, into looking into new capacities for coal. So if I talk to the coal-based power companies today in the private space, they are not looking at investing even a single paisa, including large companies like Tata Power, etc., who are behemoths of cases of going the coal path again. So if at all there will be coal capacity, it will be the public sector companies, the government-owned companies. And I personally think there will not be such a great gung-ho response to the auction, except for the ones who have cement and steel plants like the Vedantas, etc.
Right. And probably another point that Dr. Mathur mentioned, which Dr. Pradeep, maybe you could speak on, which is that a lot of developing countries have debt repayments to make. And one of the things that we know that the UN, Paris Climate Agreement called for is a green climate fund, which would help developing countries with financing to be able to go in a green direction. What's happening now with these economies that do need to make their international payment commitments, and are international financing bodies stepping in to help?
Yeah, so my reading over there is, when it comes to the Green Climate Fund and the rest, and Mr. Mathur is well aware of that, we haven't really seen we haven't been a real great beneficiary of that. I mean, we keep hearing of this money which is to come to the developing countries and to emerging countries. And given India's really, I would say, commendable way in which we have grown in renewable, we've not seen that coming.
But what is interesting is we've seen a lot of private sector, so private equity players, the Goldman Sachs of the world, or the other people, pension funds from Canada,
Right.
etc., who are willing to bet their money on the renewable sector in India.
Yeah. And what do you think, Dr. Pradeep? Is that how it's going to be? Do we have to wait for the private sector here to save developing countries?
I mean, I think it's going to require obviously partnerships at a moment like this. I think the crisis that we are seeing unfold across the world certainly has amplified many of the inequalities that exist, and therefore there is definitely a need for public support and governments to step in and be capacitated to be able to address the very many needs. And I think in that context, there certainly are a number of conversations taking place about debt relief, debt restructuring, and so on, that will essentially create the fiscal space needed for countries to take the necessary steps in this recovery process. And I think in that context, important conversations need to occur. One important one certainly is on the whole issue of fossil fuel subsidy reforms. Perhaps that could be used as a way to unlock the kind of financing that's needed, both to support some of those urgent requirements that are needed now, including things like temporary basic incomes to vulnerable marginalized communities, as well as to shift resources to the kind of green developments that we need to see, and energy sector certainly is one of them. So public finance certainly has a role to play here, and indeed funds like the Green Climate Fund are also very much cognizant of it and the need to ensure that those resources are brought to bear to support the kind of green recovery that is needed. But that is not to say that the private sector is a part player here or is a bit player. In fact, the private sector also has a significant role to play here. And I think if anything comes out of this crisis is the realization by the private sector of just how intrinsically connected business is to nature, to climate, and the need to take these things into account in their own calculus of business development, and hopefully ensuring that investments go towards the kinds of solutions that we all would like to see, and which will play an important role in taking the world out of this hole that we've managed to find ourselves in.
Yeah, and talking about the private sector, Sumant, I mean, one of the success stories for ReNew has been to bring in the renewable sector private investment from Goldman Sachs initially, but now pension funds, as Soma mentioned. Do you see that confidence that these funds had in India grow or decline given what's happened with the pandemic and the economic recession that the country is in right now? How will that shape the renewable sector?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Akshat. I guess I should say I'd like to thank Vaishali for inviting me for this panel discussion. I think that's a great question. Look, I think the pandemic is certainly a temporary one, and therefore we should not extrapolate the situation as it exists right now. There is a considerable amount of interest in India's renewable energy program from all sorts of investors. And that is for very good reasons that India has, as Dr. Mathur said and has been saying for a while, articulated a very robust program of growth in the renewable energy sector. And investors obviously flock to areas where they find that there are opportunities to invest capital and get reasonable rates of return. And so therefore there is a lot of interest. Now, having said that, it is obviously clear that during the pandemic itself, there is a market dislocation that is happening right now, notwithstanding the fact that public markets are doing very well. Clearly, in the private market, certainly there is still some degree of consternation about how things will play out. We know that power demand fell dramatically during the months of the lockdown. It is now slowly clawing its way back up, and it's now in the month of August will hopefully come back to the numbers that it was at last year at the same time. And in addition to that, the government really has gone out of its way to protect the renewable energy industry. And I think all of those steps that are being taken right now will build confidence in the sector. But having said that, I think investors will still take a step back, will wait for the pandemic to play its way through. And then once things are more settled, I think that's when you'll start seeing more new capital commitments begin to come back in. And that may take another 3 or 4 or 5 months. I mean, there are very simple things like if somebody does want to put in new capital, they can't even come to India to do diligence on the ground right now. And so how do you expect people to therefore be able to, make large investment decisions? And this is, as you know, a sector that requires large investment decisions. Having said that, the capital that was committed earlier, that I think will continue to come in. And there have been a lot of new bids, new auctions that have happened, very innovative ones, in fact. And so the sector has continued to move forward. And so my feeling is that as we come out of this whole crisis, renewables will actually be in a very good position and therefore should be in a good position to attract more and renewed interest from foreign investors into the sector.
Great. And Greg, I mean, one thing that we've talked a lot about right now has been what large institutions can do. So it's either central governments or central banks or large financial institutions. What can smaller parts of this economy, states and regions do also to help bring about a green recovery?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for having me on today. I think in the U.S., as Justin mentioned at the top, we're not seeing federal action on climate change and energy productivity, but we are seeing that on a state level in the U.S. We're seeing California and New York lead the way, but also states like New Mexico and Colorado make big commitments to deep decarbonization over the coming decade or two. We're also seeing cities leading the way in a lot of places, not just San Francisco and New York, but Houston, the oil and gas capital of the United States, committing to 100% clean electricity. And so when you have a state like Texas, that is the top wind producing state in the US, and you have a city like Houston, which is where all the oil and a lot of the LNG go in and out of the US, committing to something like that, you really have some movement there. But you're also seeing companies who are making long-term plans, big US technology companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, making huge commitments to not only decarbonizing, but decarbonizing. Microsoft is going to remove all the carbon they've emitted since the 1970s. You're seeing US utilities committing to get to zero carbon emissions within a decade or two. And then you're seeing European oil and gas companies like BP and Equinor committing to switching their investments from oil and gas to renewables and other things. So I think you're seeing a lot of movement even without federal action in the US. And I think that is a good sign that people are ready to move if there was that signal going forward.
Yeah. And one aspect of this sort of green recovery has been, at least in Europe, where we do have a plan on green recovery, is that the money is not just being spent on immediate deployment of renewables or immediate improvements in certain sectors of clean energy, but there's some amount of money that's also being dedicated to long-term technology. So hydrogen has gained a lot of interest in the funds that are being given out, at least here in Europe. Justin, do you see any sort of similar movement on hydrogen in the US, for example, where again, the potential for the fuel is quite high?
It's an interesting question. I mean, certainly the conversation around hydrogen in Europe and Australia, I think, is more evolved than in the US. There is conversation, you do hear about hydrogen from some of the majors here, but I think that the conversation tends to fall, I mean, it's just less evolved. I think that's probably the bottom line.
Yeah. What sort of long-term technology developments do you think a green recovery, if it does come through in the US, would look to support?
Well, I don't know if Greg wants to hop in, but I think a lot of the, there is longer term R&D, discussions around longer term R&D. A lot of people in the US, frankly, people who are connected with the oil and gas industry are interested in carbon capture. I think a lot of, there needs to be, rather there doesn't need to be, but there is a lot of discussion around infrastructure, for existing technology as well. And I think that's where a good portion of stimulus spending would go towards things like electric vehicle charging stations. But if Greg wanted to hop in on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the hydrogen, we've been spending a lot of time talking about hydrogen, but, in a heavy duty, big trucks, marine ships kind of scenario, but also for decarbonizing industrial heat and ways to make cement and glass and things like that and steel with less emissions. I mean, I think some of the other things that we may see investment in, there's a pretty thriving advanced nuclear energy industry in the US that is building, not these giant, 2,000 megawatt plants, but 50 megawatt plants or 20 megawatt plants that can be mass produced in a factory that I think are working their way through the regulatory system, but need a lot more investment. Battery storage, there's deep geothermal, companies that are currently doing oil and gas drilling and fracking can pivot and do these deep geothermal wells that provide that, secure base energy. But I mean, I think if you, one of the best things about the US is our national lab system. And if you look there, there's investment and, research being done on all of these different things, from things that'll be ready in a year to things that might not be ready for 20 years. And I think we're going to see a lot of investment in that in the next year or two.
And that's a good place. I mean, Suman, Dr. Mathur mentioned the round-the-clock renewable auction that ReNew won. I mean, what are you seeing from an India perspective, the sorts of cutting-edge technologies that A, we are working on, or B, we need in the country? You're muted.
Yeah, what we're working on is unfortunately nothing that terrific. We don't really have a very big R&D culture in the country. We don't have national laboratories. We don't really have good industry academia collaboration, although we've set up a center of excellence at IIT Delhi. But frankly speaking, Indian corporates don't really invest that much in R&D. And that's actually one of the big drawbacks of our entire, not just renewable energy program, but I would say our industrial policies. It's really a failing of the country. Now, what we do require is, we obviously require technologies around the whole issue of grid integration of renewables in as we go forward. Renewables is going to become bigger and bigger. So grid integration is going to become a bigger deal. And so therefore, whether that's through batteries, whether that's through better grid management and, better software, better digital capabilities, all of those are areas that we need to do work on. The second is that now, given the government's push for self-reliant India, we will be trying to now indigenize the manufacturing value chain more and more. And as we do that, you can't just have a static manufacturing setup. You need to have constant investments, constant upgradation. Because if there's one thing that we've seen the Chinese do very well, is this constant investment in technology and manufacturing improvements, which is really what has driven pricing for solar, among other reasons, down so dramatically. So if we don't keep investing, and if you have a static system, then very soon we'll start getting outcosted again, despite any duty structure protection that we have. So we need a lot of investments in, therefore, as we set up the manufacturing supply chain or value chain, we need therefore also concomitantly along with that, investments in the entire R&D facility on new age and cutting edge solar technologies. And that's in the entire back end of the value chain, all the way from polysilicon to modules. So that's, I think, another area where we require a lot of investments. I think beyond that, we have a big wind turbine manufacturing industry in India, but again, very little actual research going on improvement in turbine technology. And India is a very specific country with not very high wind speeds, and therefore we need very specifically designed wind turbines for India. And most of the companies that are now large in India are all the European companies like Gamesa or Vestas, or for that matter, GE. And these people design turbines for their home markets, or the bigger markets, which are really class 2 or higher wind speed turbine or countries, and then they just sort of slap it on a little bit here and there, and then present it to us. And those are not the most appropriate turbines for India. And so we need research into that area as well. So there are lots and lots of areas that we need research on. We need research to be specific to India, and it needs to be done in India, I think, by Indian engineers to build that entire ecosystem in the country.
Yeah. And we're coming up to the halfway mark. I wanted to just say, people who are watching on Zoom, you'll be able to post a question if you go in your Q&A section, and I'll get to those questions as we go through the conversation. Sumant happened to have answered a question which came in about the viability of the solar value chain. I think I'll pick up one other question, and maybe Dr. Mathur can reply, which is there are sort of co-benefits in the green recovery where you can cut carbon emissions and you can make changes in, say, air quality, which can play a big role in pushing through clean technology. We know that in India, air pollution has been a problem in major cities. How much more how much has been done and how much more needs to be done?
Very clearly, everything that has been done in India has been driven by what is called by co-benefits, but I would argue that they are the real benefits and carbon reduction is the co-benefit. So the fact that we need electricity without imported fuels, the fact that we need electricity without pollution is what drove renewables in this market. And climate was a great co-benefit. Similarly, in the years ahead, air pollution is going to be a major driver. We're already seeing a large amount of effort going into seeing how the agricultural wastes, which will be burnt in a month's time in Punjab and create horrible air quality in Delhi, how can they be used for energy generation? As Suman said earlier, unfortunately, we do not have a very strong R&D base where fundamentally new technologies and processes can be developed. But what I hope is that we can create the demand which will bring in the technologies that are needed. I think we do have a rather successful ecosystem which has been able to convert demand into supply, into technologies coming in and being supplied at scale. Long story short, I think this is a story that you need to watch. Similarly, we will probably start seeing electric vehicles coming in because of pollution reasons in urban areas. Not because they're electric vehicles, but because they create a greener environment. Similarly, in industry, you will probably see things like hydrogen coming in because they lead to lower prices than, say, the petroleum fuels which have been used otherwise. So very clearly, it is these benefits which drive the use of renewable resources, which then also lead to climate benefits.
Yeah. One other, one thing, Dr. Pradeep, I wanted to bring you in, which is, the drawdown initiative clearly points to women empowerment as a key way to enable a greener future. How much are we, we know that conceptually that is a really good thing to have. How much is, financing in this sector looking at helping women become a bigger part of the conversation?
Yeah, I think, in the context of certainly what's happening today, we see that most of the impacts of the COVID crisis does disproportionately affect a lot of women. I think we know that, given the proportion of women such as health and other key agricultural sectors, for example, a lot of them are affected through this. And I think in that context, certainly UNDP is prioritizing interventions that will address many of these needs and the inequalities that are currently so dominant in a number of countries around the world. I think there isn't sufficient resourcing that is still targeting the kind of specific interventions which are needed to ensure that there's a strong empowerment and engagement of women in the kind of decision making that's needed. And that's something that I think needs to be prioritized and supported across the board.
Yeah, and Soma, is that, I mean, is that a, gender parity, which, in India is also a huge, huge issue and has been historically. Is that something that is being talked about in the clean energy sector, in the decarbonization conversations that you have with industry?
Muted.
So I wouldn't say we are up to the mark. It's there, but it's very, very little and far too little than what is required. We need to be much more alert to it. We don't see it particularly amongst policymakers. They don't seem to realize the need for gender sensitivity in the energy dialogues. I do see some of it in industries. I think ReNew is one of those few which has really taken up gender issues very, very strongly. And I'm really happy that Vaishali is on this panel. But one thing which has happened, and it's almost, I would say, like what Dr. Mathur said, a co-benefit or a collateral advantage is, the government of India pushed this thing of replacing in the hinterland, pushing off LPG gas cylinders instead of the fireworks that was used. Now, if you see, the beneficiary for that were actually the women folk, mostly in the rural sector, because they were the ones who were going out to collect the wood. They were the ones whose health was at stake. They were the ones, education of their children was at stake. And I think now that they have become the beneficiaries of these gas cylinders, which is also a form of energy, which is definitely greener. It is fossil fuel, but it's greener than the wood that they burnt. They have, kind of gained. So I think that is a fallout, which I always say is one small little thing that has happened in India's energy story when it comes to women.
Yeah, I think it's also a counterintuitive thing that most people don't realize, that the use of fossil fuels in specific areas today is actually a cleaner option than what exists. And that's something that, especially in developing countries, is an issue that is, requires more attention. I think I'm going to try and bring in a question from the audience, and this is, anybody can raise your hand if you'd like to take it, but the question is, which clean energy technology, is it carbon capture, is it batteries, is it hydrogen, has the highest probability of being adopted in the short term by Indian industries? Dr. Mathur, do you want to take this one?
Well, in a certain sense, this is a no-brainer. In the short term, it has to be EV and batteries. In the longer term, I think there is going to be a kind of a race between charging infrastructure for electric vehicles on the one hand, and electrolyzers for making hydrogen from electricity and then from green electricity on the other hand. So I think between these three, these will form the vast majority of applications that we will see coming into the commercial sector over the next 15, 20 years.
Yeah. And just going back to the point that we were talking with Soma, Greg, you had something to say on that.
I just wanted to echo Pradeep and Soma's comments on women and girls in the clean energy space. Something that we've been spending a lot of time working on lately. We just did our Future Leaders Summit focused on young people in the energy and climate space and developing, putting younger people into the policymaking process and getting them ready to be leaders in government and companies. And I think, our group that we brought together was more than 60% female. And so I think, one of the ways we make sure that the equity in the clean energy transition is by making sure that the people in the room and at the table are representative of the people being impacted. So I just wanted to make sure to say that. And then to Dr. Mathur's answer, I think we need all of those technologies right away. We need solar and we need wind and we need batteries, but carbon capture and storage is critically important. going forward. It's just not the immediate thing that's going to save us in the next year or so.
Yeah, and I think just sticking with you, Greg, there's another aspect to this where we're sort of right now, most of our conversation has been what is the US doing within the US and what is India doing within India. But there's a lot of crosstalk that needs to happen, not just between US and India, but just globally. What is happening there, specifically looking at a green recovery? Are there initiatives across the countries that are worth highlighting?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of conversations happening out there about green recovery. Where we do a track 2 dialogue between the US and India that we've been doing for more than 10 years. We also do one with China, US and China, that we've been doing for about 6 years. And I think, in some ways coordinating those conversations and making sure we're all rowing the boat in the same direction is pretty important. The EU has been leading on this. And is kind of out in front of everybody else. But, I think over the next year or two, as we kind of move from stopping our free fall to getting into recovery and to, being in recovery, hopefully in the next 12 to 18 months, a lot of money is going to be spent between, just the EU, the US, India, and China. A ton of money on infrastructure and clean energy. And the way we spend that money is so critically important. We could spend $20 billion in the US on schools, and we could do it in, the old way, or we could do it in the clean energy way with solar panels and batteries and clean buses. We could rebuild the roads and bridges. We could do it with high emissions, surfaces, or we could do it with lower emission surfaces. And so I think the way we shape these is going to be so important.
Yeah. And I think Dr. Pradeep wants to make a point. Go on.
Yeah, no, if I could come in there on this, I think, there are so many issues here that need to be tackled, which in many ways aren't really specific to COVID. First, how do you actually make sure that that transition happens? Well, you need to get some of the basics right. You need to make sure that your policy environment, your enabling space is created to facilitate the kind of confidence that's needed for investors to come in. We need to make sure there's access to finance, because ultimately a lot of this will need a blending of different sources of finance for it to work. We need to make sure that ultimately, there's a lot of de-risking work that takes place in order to, again, create the space for the kind of investments that one needs to see. And that also involves understanding long-term risks so that you can create the kind of confidence for investors so that they can look at some of these opportunities. And I think there's so many of these basic things that need to be done in so many countries that it's sometimes in some ways almost a little bit despondent that these things still haven't been done. And we're still talking about it, 20, 25 years later. When we really should be trying to talk about, well, what have we learned from these successes or failures? So I feel like we really need to focus a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think in some way, there's this notion that what we're seeing in the pandemic is a fire drill for the future, where climate impacts are going to get worse and worse and worse, while we'll have to deal with other problems that happen in society. And so can we really manage that? And I think this is a good place to bring in another problem, which is China. So the relationship with, just global relationships with China are fraying, be that because of Hong Kong, be that because of border issues in India, be that because of trade in the US. And maybe we can speak about China for a little bit and start with Sumant, where we know that India's sort of fraying relationships with China may impact the solar industry. It certainly has started impacting other industries. What can be done so that impact doesn't hurt Indian industries?
Well, no, it does appear that relationships with China, and India and China have crossed a certain point. And it appears, based on all the stuff that one hears from the government, that it is going to be hard to bring it back to the level it was at earlier. And so, therefore, we've been getting very clear-cut messaging from our minister, the Minister of Power and Renewable Energy, that we have to now make sure that the value chain gets indigenized, that we stop importing equipment for the power sector, for the renewable energy sector from China. You should just stop it. There's a very clear signal to that effect. But it's one thing to have an intent. It's another thing to obviously make this transition happen. Now, there are, of course, many issues to deal with. The first of those is that about 30,000 megawatts of solar projects have already been bid out, assuming module imports from China, right? And 30,000 is not a small number. It's a big number, right? And all of these modules were supposed to be imported over the next 2 years. Now, if the import duty gets imposed, then there has to be some mechanism of transitioning these 30,000 megawatts in a way that it doesn't hurt the developers. And the question is, who's going to bear this extra cost? At this point, the way it's being designed by the government, but we still have to wait for the final contours, it's going to result in an automatic increase in tariffs. By automatic, I mean either there is a formula-based increase in tariffs, or we go through the regulatory process, which takes its own time, and there is an increase in tariffs as a result of that, which means that the Indian consumer pays for the extra cost, and the money is collected by the customs duty, which is a part of the central government of India. So in some ways, it's going to result in a transfer from Indian consumers and retail payers to the government. And then, of course, the question is, can the government really use this money collected in the best possible manner to encourage further development, incentivization of the manufacturing value chain? Right. So I think that is the first most important question. The second question is, how do you really protect the domestic market in a way that no foreign imports are allowed to come in, and you give that visibility for at least an 8 to 10 year period, so that people are actually able to make investments in the manufacturing value chain? Because everybody knows that Indian manufacturing is going to be at least 25 to 30% more expensive than Chinese modules. Now, if there's any way for the Chinese modules to come in, whether through the free trade agreement countries like the ASEAN countries and so on, then you will not be able to protect domestic manufacturing as well as you need to, and therefore no investments will happen. And if no investments happen, then you'll forever have this problem of continuing to import, but there'll just be a duty, and you'll never actually be able to develop the domestic manufacturing chain. So it's very important to see how the government actually goes ahead and protects the domestic market in a really watertight way and gives that visibility for 8 to 10 years. We have not yet reached that point, despite all the best intents. And we are, as a company, very keen to invest in manufacturing, right? Because we see that as a good opportunity, but we can only do so if that protection is there. So there are quite a few issues that have to be dealt with. Still.
Exactly. And in some way, I mean, I'll bring Justin in here because the US has been running maybe, on a much larger scale, an experiment of that sort. Trump's promise on bringing in tariffs was he'll bring jobs back from China. Well, has that happened? And if not, what does the future China-US relationship look like under a change of presidency?
Right. Well, I think the U.S.-China relationship obviously has faltered in large part due to the tactics that the president has employed. But I think a future President Biden will have had the experience of the Obama administration, where they used climate as a point of agreement. And it was central. I mean, you can talk to John Kerry, former Secretary of State John Kerry. You can talk to people who worked on the ground in Beijing, and they'll say, well, when we disagreed about trade, when we disagreed about the South China Sea, we always knew we could come together on climate. And that was a way that they were able to keep the relationship healthy. And I think that, this is something that Biden talks about. He talks about, coming back and trying to rebuild the relationship with China, both to deal with climate and also to, address all these other issues. And so, I think a early 2021 move from a President Biden would include probably trying to make some big gesture with China that would allow for, progress throughout the year on the issue. Yeah. Akshat, you're muted.
I'm going to take another audience question here. And maybe Greg, you can pick this one up. What have you seen in the US that has allowed for industry-academia collaboration that others could replicate?
Yeah, the way the US research and development system is set up is a lot of the funding comes from the federal government, but is put out into university system, into the university system, more than 2,000 universities, but also the national lab system. And the national labs have the ability to bring in universities, to bring in companies and do joint research projects. And then there's a tech transfer feature that helps push that research out into the world to be built. And, I think when I worked at the Department of Energy, one of the things that we would always say is every battery and every electric vehicle and every hybrid vehicle in the US was developed in one of the national labs, but it was commercialized by industry. And so, having set up that and having that relatively solid funding base, it's not nearly enough and it needs to be a lot more, but that leads to companies building the products that the labs are developing, and then that leads to export of those products around the world.
Yeah. Another audience question, and maybe Dr. Pradeep, you can take this one. How does a developing country, say Ecuador or Belize, prioritize its investments in clean energy, and what are the challenges for its survival?
Well, I mean, I don't think, the general issues are too different from what I spoke about earlier. I mean, there are certainly efforts underway in the context of setting climate-related targets under the NDCs to review and evaluate different options for investment, including obviously in the energy sector, which plays an important role in the overall emissions that countries have now made a commitment to cut. And in that context, some of the constraints in information, understanding of the viability of these different options certainly play a big role in understanding what exactly is viable. But then ultimately, once you do have those options and a better understanding of it, you come back to the other issues which also need to be addressed, which is unless the conditions are right, you're not going to attract the kind of investments that you need to scale up. And you're going to be perennially dependent on public finance to get some of these going, which is not the kind of solution we want to see. So the two need to go hand in hand.
I mean, one sort of follow-up to that is we've seen in the last 2 years that these climate movements, protests on the street, be that in New York or London or even in Delhi, have had an impact. And, that's a tiny fraction of the population that comes out and does this. In the UN system, we've seen these sorts of groups form together. So the small island nations group have come together. Could one thing that small economies be doing is pushing large economies to do more? And what sort of system does the UN provide for those voices to be heard by the large economies?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is certainly one of the great appeals of a platform such as the United Nations, which affords, equal voice to all countries and creates a real level playing field for the kind of conversations that need to take place. And it is going to require exactly that, a concerted, joined up effort in order for us to, enter the new world that we all need to. And in that context, I think the multi-stakeholder platforms that are available and made use of by countries, by different constituents, by different groupings, to discuss and debate, the various issues that pertain to each one, and finding solutions to those, I think is one of the great advantages of a platform such as the United Nations.
Yeah, and Dr. Mathur, I'll bring you in for an audience question. How do the panelists feel their response is to supporting rural populations or immigrants or other vulnerable communities? And maybe this in the Indian context that, it's particularly relevant given the difficulties that vulnerable people felt through this year, through the pandemic. What can we do on climate to help these communities?
It's very clear that people who have migrated, largely they've been forced to migrate to rural areas, whether because of the situations in urban areas or any other situation. They need jobs. And consequently, there is a huge need to develop rural jobs, and particularly rural jobs in green industry. So I'll give you an example. For example, in India, there is a huge, a crying need for cold chains, which therefore looks at people, it looks at technology, and if you can do cold chains in a climate friendly style, you've got green as well. So for example, a couple of years ago, we worked with a developer of cold chains to see how a biomass gasifier could be used with a ammonia-based cooling system. And it's now being used commercially, supplying, I think, mangoes to Walmart in Lucknow, if I'm not wrong. But the point remains that there are options available, technological options, which are green, which are rural, and which create jobs.
I'm also going to take another audience question, which is, and maybe Greg, you can pick this one up. We are seeing that countries are becoming inward-looking, or populism, or going in the direction of electing populists. How much of that will become a hindrance for climate action?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be a hindrance because it reduces the collaboration among nations. If every country has to develop its own technology solutions, that's just that much more work. I mean, I think one of the fundamentals to decarbonizing is energy efficiency, and if you can reduce the amount of work that has to be done globally, then you can spread that investment out a little further. I mean, I think that, while we've seen that over the last couple of years, a very, America-focused, Indian-focused, I think that broadly, the Paris Agreement really brought together, almost 200 nations to agree on a general spot on the horizon to move towards. And I think that generally the world is still moving towards that. We just need to move a little faster. And I think that can overcome, the inward nature of that's been happening around the world over the last couple of years.
Yeah. And one other, yeah, go on.
For example, populism, public needs, and particularly, as Greg said, energy efficiency can come together. And for example, I'll give you the example of air conditioning in India. It's something that is needed. Any populist would work towards creating a greater and greater market for energy efficiency. But at the same time, if you make sure that every air conditioner sold is more efficient than the one sold yesterday, then you are better off. And the people are better off because their bills are smaller.
Yeah. Another audience question, and maybe Dr. Pradeep, you can take this one. Sort of speaks to a point, but I think there's more to be said, which is, will the pandemic disrupt the transfer of funds from developed countries to emerging countries, to emerging economies?
I don't think so. I mean, as we are speaking right now, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund Board, is having its 26th meeting, and there's a significant pipeline of initiatives that are up for board approval. And those resources will begin to kick in. I think the challenge we're seeing right now, and certainly we are trying to find solutions to this, and it's not always easy, is in many of these countries, it's really the disruption to supply chains and the ability to actually move things from place to place, with the quarantine restrictions and so on and so forth. That's really now slowing down the ability to expand some of these resources. That really is a challenge in small island developing states, particularly where there are outer islands and outer communities that are hard to reach, certainly in large parts of Africa and so on and so forth. So we definitely see a slowing down of the ability to implement many of these opportunities that are out there. But at the same time, I mean, the reality is that the amount of public finance that's available out there that flows to these countries is really a drop in the ocean to what is required. And there, it really must be about, well, what can we do in this period of time to get the basics right in terms of the enabling environment, the incentives, the regulatory framework, so that when we do get out of this, and we will, we are able to catapult into that future we want to see as fast as possible.
Yeah. Soma, another audience question that would be great to get your thoughts on is, does India need a national plan that also integrates sustainable cities in its plan, and it doesn't just let states handle that?
Yeah, so I think the plan is already there. I mean, if you look at the smart cities rollout and the program which was launched by the government for 100 smart cities to start with, it was about developing sustainable smart cities, and therefore it was put down in the policy as to how the cities would look at sustainable ways when it comes to transport, when it comes to energy, when it comes to buildings. All of these were there. The question is how much of that is really happening. So if you're asking, if the question is whether we should have a plan, yes, 100% we should have a plan, and the plan is there. But it's implementation, which I think is where we are stuck.
Right. We're coming close to the end of our time, so I'm just going to try and in the next round of question and answers, if there are any remarks that you wanted to make, you haven't made, please do make them. But
I had just one remark, and I was just wanting to add on to what Suman said vis-a-vis China. The fact that what is happening with China, given the government of India's kind of proclamation that we're not going to import from China, and that has put to risk many of the projects which have bid out. It also comes at a time when India is trying to be competitive. The cost of doing business in India is perhaps the highest because cost of power. I mean, cost of power in India is perhaps the highest in the emerging countries. It is already much higher because industry actually subsidizes for the inefficiency, not so much for the lower cost which you give to domestic and agriculture. Top to that, if you're going to increase the tariffs now, imagine what it's going to do to competitiveness of Indian industry, which is also likely to go out to the world to compete with its counterparts. So I think it's a very, very, I don't know. I mean, it's a question which is
very complex.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to bring Sumant in and Dr. Mathur both again as sort of concluding remarks, but on from your own perspectives on this. We talked about how R&D isn't a part of the Indian DNA, whether it be government or corporations. But ReNew does R&D, and so what is it that you can talk about from your own lessons that other corporations can take away? What are your solid sort of bottom line benefits from having done research within your own firm?
To be honest with you, Akshat, we have set up a very small R&D activity. I would not say it's at a point where it is leading to very significant outputs yet, but we have tried our best to look at tackling all of our issues and finding solutions to our problems ourselves. But I would say that they are really more incremental at this point. And part of the reason is that we are a project-driven company. We're not a manufacturing company. And I think the bigger amount of research benefits will come on the manufacturing side. If you look at the overall value chain, the projects part accounts for about 1/3 of the total value creation. The equipment side accounts for about 2/3 of the value creation, right? And I'm not taking O&M and all of that into account right now. So it's really the 2/3 where a bulk of the actual benefits of R&D can really come in and kick in. On the project side, there's relatively less that you can do, right? So I would say that yes, we are trying our best in our own limited way as much as possible, but really there's a lot more that needs to be done by companies that are on the manufacturing side. And surely as we invest in the manufacturing side, we will obviously invest much more on the R&D side there as well. But if I may just give you one closing remark, which is, picking up from a point that Pradeep had made earlier, he said that we need to do all of the above. And I think that is something that all of us here would subscribe to, that the problem of climate change is so immense that whether it's carbon capture, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's sustainable cities, all of those things need to be done all at the same time. And in addition to that, there are a number of functional things that cut through all of these. One is policy making. So policy making, the quality of policy making has to really, really, be really improved, and the speed of policy making has to be improved, because very often governments work in a fairly slow and ponderous way. Take our issue around creating duty protection for manufacturing. It's been going around for some time. So like that, there are many other issues that need quicker and speedier decision making. The second thing is financing. That's a very, very big area. And, we should not really be reliant upon multilaterals or the public sector to provide that financing. That is just not going to happen given the scale of financing we require. It is going to come from private sources. And for that, you need to have a good investment environment and then just let the market do its thing, right? And Green Climate Fund and all of that is terrific, but that's going to deal with niche problems that otherwise the commercial markets can't deal with. But the bulk of the heavy lifting has to be done by commercial capital. And one of the problems in India specifically, to relate it back to the point that Suma was making, is that in India, the cost of capital is incredibly high, right? And so the cost of power is high, but so is the cost of capital. And so therefore, that is actually increasing the cost of doing anything in India as well, including the cost of generating renewable energy, which could have been almost a cent lower, down from around 3.5, 4 cents right now, if the cost of capital had been lower. And the last thing I would say, is that we need we don't think enough about the execution side of this whole equation. We just think that if we do all of these things on the policy side, things will automatically happen. But the reality is that on the execution side, just setting up the crazy amount of renewable energy that we require, the crazy amount of energy efficiency that we have to do, the crazy amount of work we have to do on the electric vehicle side, all of these require a tremendous amount of effort. And frankly, I don't see enough being done on the effort side. And that is at some point also going to become a constraining factor. It is not going to get dealt with by itself.
Yeah. And Dr. Mathur, on the same point, what can Indian government do to support R&D in this sector? We do have some world-class institutions. Do they not have enough money, or do we not have enough world-class institutions, or what is holding India back?
I think the question is one of what is it that we're trying to solve. Unfortunately, our institutions have been much more on the supply side of technology. The places where we have been successful is where the demand is clear. And as Suman said, it's private commercial capital which goes in. All over the country, you will see examples of this in rural areas, what are known as jugaads, which meet a local need. It is innovation. But there, the link between the guy doing the innovation and the need is like next to each other. Consequently, how do we create demand on the one side and at large enough scale? So one of the things that has happened is that the Indian market has grown large enough now. And the second thing is, how do we get all those institutions that are involved in technology development to talk where this demand is there? And I think, so number one, what is needed is demand creation. And number two, what is needed is for government to lubricate the processes of bringing these technology institutions together with the demand. What is this lubrication? Government programs saying that we will support research for this particular purpose, where this particular purpose is linked to where the demand is. I think it is those kinds of dedicated programs. So, one of the areas where we've been very successful is the pharma industry, where the Department of Biotechnology almost forced a marriage between the pharma companies on the one side and the R&D institutions on the other. There's no reason why it can't happen in green energy.
Right, that's good. And then just to conclude, remarks from Justin and Greg on if there is a change in administration, Justin, how quickly will America be able to convince the world that it is again, a player that wants to be in the Paris Climate Agreement, wants to be fighting climate change, and will stick with it this time?
Well, I think it's a very tricky question. I think, for one thing, the signal will be clear. It would be clear immediately from a Biden president. That would be, rhetorically speaking, and obviously the U.S. would rejoin or stay in the Paris Agreement. But I mean, in terms of actually passing legislation, actually doing the policy work that would underpin, confidence around the globe, that's a much trickier proposition. I think, it's possible, depending on how the election plays out, that could happen in February. It's also possible that that would be a long, windy policymaking process that could take quite a bit of time. But I think that the world is probably eager to see, to take a President Biden, at his word, and to actually act on that.
Right. And maybe there's something positive from 2020 that you could bring up, Greg, in the direction we are heading. What about the Biden plan excites you? Perhaps that might be the thing to end on.
Something optimistic about 2020. All right. Well, I think, Justin's right. There could be an immediate signal in November that, the U.S. is back in, and there, if there's a Biden presidency. I think that there's going to be a lot of distrust among other nations. The U.S. left the world at the altar, and I don't think that the world is going to let us just come back, just erase the last 4 years and pretend it didn't happen. So I think that there's going to be a lot of rebuilding of trust across the globe with every nation. And I think it's going to start at home at the U.S. And, we're going to have to do things in the U.S. that show that we're serious about climate change. I think that the thought leadership around climate change has really evolved in the last 12 months in the U.S. We saw during the Democratic primaries, we saw more than a dozen fantastic climate plans come out. We have a candidate now that has a really strong climate plan in Joe Biden. And I think that implementing that is going to be the next step. So finding the right people, finding the right mechanisms to do that, hopefully, having leadership on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, that can get behind that is going to be critically important. And then coming back to the world and saying, hey, we're back.
That's great. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand this back to Vaishali. You're muted.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Aksha. That was brilliant moderation. Really appreciate all the thought-provoking questions you asked. And thank you to the panelists for raising some great points. Some of them which resonated were around engaging women and the younger generation, which is the need of the hour. And it's good to see Aspen's doing its bit. We'd like to see more of this happening in India. Of course, renewables will see renewed interest after COVID. That sounds like music to our ears in this session. And let market do its thing. And I think that's just the best way for, I think any idea to evolve. And a comment by Dr. Mathur, ironical, but a very important question. Can we use more waste for clean energy generation? In living in Delhi, I can say that that's critical. It's wonderful to see blue skies, which are never there for most of the year. So lots to be done post-COVID. I think we really need to also ensure we're all working and operating in a collaborative way, globally engaging with key stakeholders. And we require committed political leadership, climate-sensitive policy making, and businesses adopting more sustainable practices as well. Come November, let's hope the US election outcome is cooler and it can contribute towards cooling this climate issue a little bit more. Thank you all for joining us and taking out the time. I was the host, Soma, not the panelist, so it's a better position to be in. I really enjoyed listening to each one of you. And once again, thank you. Stay safe and well, and I hope to see you all in person once all of this is behind us. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.